Welcome to the first in our series of panel discussions about legal considerations for high growth startups. Today we'll be talking about different corporate structures for startups to consider, kind of the pros and cons of the various legal structures available. Next week we'll be talking about venture capital term sheets. The following week we will talk about M&A legal issues for startups. And then we will conclude the series with a session about employment law. And overall, the point of the series is, to cover cover the legal issues that all startup founders need to understand. So I'm Brett Waters. I've been in Silicon Valley my entire life, living the dream of a serial entrepreneur. And today I teach entrepreneurship at Stanford University. I coach startup CEOs at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and I run the Fourthly Startup Accelerator. And with me this morning are two super smart Silicon Valley attorneys to discuss this whole topic. Natasha, good morning.
Good morning, Brett. How are you?
And I'm fine. Where are you joining us from today?
Today I'm actually in Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley, California. Yeah, very nearby me. So, Natasha, give us the brief background on yourself.
Absolutely. Natasha Allen, I'm a partner at Foley & Lardner, have been working with startups and in this ecosystem for over a decade. My practice is the full life cycle of a corporation. So anywhere from inception all the way to M&A and exit strategies.
Perfect. And also with us is my fish taco buddy, Louie. Morning, Leo. Morning, Louie.
Good morning, Brett. Good morning, Natasha. Thank you so much for pulling all this together with us, Brett. I'm super excited to launch this series with the both of you and to talk about what is dearest to my heart, getting these startups off the ground. And I think the first topic that we might hit is, before you launch your new startup, what do? You might have a job. You might have signed a proprietary invention assignment agreement with your current employer, that sort of thing. But I'll kick it back to you, Brett.
Yeah, well, before we get started in the discussion, Louie, give us the brief backgrounder on you.
Oh, I'm Louie. I help startups get formed, financed, scaled for growth, bought and sold. I have fabulous partners like Natasha and a great team of lawyers. And what we really aim to do, Brett, is solve three problems that all startups have. Is how do you get started? What's the right legal structure? How do you raise money? And then once you have money, how do you put in place a financial structure so that you can raise more money or make revenue and report it back? So we're working with several hundred companies at all stages of growth. We also work with a lot of seed investors, and it makes for a beautiful ecosystem, Brett. It's all goodness.
It's all goodness. So, before we get started with the discussion, I'd like to invite the audience to type into the chat box where you're joining us from today. It'd be interesting to see where around the world our audience is. So, Louis, you already kind of put your finger on what I think is one of the biggest questions that many entrepreneurs have, which is when should I incorporate? When should I form a legal entity? Help us understand.
That is a great question. And before you jump, you got to look carefully at both sides of the street. And, the first thing you got to do is look at your current employment arrangements with your current employer, if you have one, and make sure that whatever ideation you are creating is on a different machine, not the same computer as the one Google gave you, not the same phone as Apple gave you. And not using company email or company communication channels to be building. Also, not doing it during company hours, making sure that it's clear that you're doing it on your nights and weekends. So that's the very first thing. The second thing is, as you said, when is the right time to jump? And there is no right answer to that question. Natasha, how do you answer that when people ask?
I think it is. I think you're correct. There is no right answer. I think because I've had companies that form before they even have a product or have finalized an idea. So it really just depends on when you think you want to launch, and if you have the stellar group that you think can take you there, then you start. But I don't think that there is a a magic answer in terms of when to jump. The other thing I'd add in terms of leaving a current employer, just look out to see if there are some processes in place. I know some of the larger tech companies have a department that you have to go to, and there's some process you have to go through if you are going to jump off and do your own adventure.
I'm going to add just a couple points there, Brett. At some point in this ideation, and I know smart people who are working on 3 or 4 projects at any one time, but at some point you've got to start telling the world about it, about your idea, and maybe you're going to want to apply to Y Combinator to help accelerate it. Maybe you're going to want to go talk to a customer and sign up a proof of concept. There's some point, and it's different for every startup, where you've got to get out in the open and you're no longer stealth. And I think that's the time that you've really got to break away from your current employer. The other question is when you legally form. And whenever you're out in the world acting on behalf of a business, you really want to have that business incorporated, and you want to be speaking on behalf of it. Because the way United States corporate law works in every 50 states, and every one of the 50 states, is that your corporate liability can be put in a box, and it's called a corporation or a limited liability company, what have you. We're going to go through all of that. And it protects you because it means that if there's any kind of a dispute, it's with the business, the company, not you. So you don't want to be transacting in the world in your own name when it's about a business. You certainly wouldn't want to get sued for patent infringement personally, for example. So very important to use these corporate structures to form. And that's why we're here today, Brett.
It is.
Yeah, and Gal jumps in with a comment that definitely before you take capital, for sure you want to have a separate legal entity then, for sure, because you don't want to mix personal funds and corporate funds.
Exactly.
Just expand on what you said, Louis. I think that my answer when somebody asks me, when should I form a legal entity for my startup, my answer is usually whenever you're exposing yourself to liability, which is kind of more or less what you said. But liability can take a variety of forms. I mean, these days, even having a website up exposes you to some sort of liability. And certainly, signing a lease or taking any money from anybody or any of those things means taking on some liability. And as Louis said, you want to take advantage of the fact that under the law, the liabilities of a company, a corporation, a legally formed entity, are separate from the liabilities and assets of you as an individual. So you want to take advantage of that separation before you expose yourself to any liability. Does that seem right, you guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Honorary Juris Doctor Taco for you, Brett.
Okay, so now we've kind of established now kind of when, which is whenever you expose yourself to liability, and that, as Louis said, that might even be just being out there talking about it. And Louis also, I just want to circle back really quick on the point Louis made at the very beginning, because it's a super good one, which is that if, most startups begin as a side project while you're working for your employer. And almost certainly your employment contract with your employer says that any IP you create while you are on the clock belongs to them. And so it's really, really important that if you're working on a startup on the side, that you, as Louis and Natasha already said, don't be writing code in the company laptop. Don't be having phone calls about your startup in the company conference room on a company call, because all of that opens you up to your employer laying claim to the intellectual property that you've created. Okay, so back to the forming a legal entity thing. So there are a variety of options under U.S. law, and even though most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is U.S. law, most countries have some kind of version of these same kinds of legal entities. So in the U.S., it's typically choosing between an LLC or a corporation, and then within a corporation, there's S-Corp and C-Corp. So, Natasha, how do you think through, a new client comes to you and says they got a startup and they want to form an entity, LLC, C-Corp, S-Corp, how do you talk a client through that decision?
I talk to them about what they want the entity to do in the future, right? So what's your end goal? Typically, if you're looking to get VC funding, if you're looking to kind of reward your employees with options and things of that nature, that's when you go the C-Corp route, right? If you have an LLC, you're not looking for venture funding, you just want to limit your liability. Absolutely a good way to go is to form an LLC, but it really depends on what's your end game. If your end game is, look, I want to go get VC funding, I want to be able to, provide options to my employees to incentivize them to grow our business, then you'd be going the C-Corp route. If you tell me that I have no interest in getting VC funding, I'd say you can go the LLC route.
Right.
And even just to go back on that too,
Yeah.
like a lot of our clients start out at LLCs, right? It's usually the first step that people take. And that's not to say that that's wrong, because you could always flip or convert into a C-Corp, right? It's costs more money, obviously, right? So if you know from the outset that, no, this is something where it's going to be a VC play, I'd say start with a C-Corp. But if you're not sure, start with an LLC, and you can always convert into a C-Corp later on.
And just for our audience to understand, there's a very fundamental difference here, which is with LLCs, there are no shares of stock. There is no concept of shares of stock. No. And so there is no easy way to say, Louis owns 12.6% of the company and Natasha owns 8.3% of the company, et cetera. So that's a pretty fundamental difference between an LLC and a corporation, is they both give you liability protection. Yep. But an LLC, there is no concept of shares of stock. There are members who are kind of the owners. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the default is that the members are all equal owners.
Default is that. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a pretty big difference from, a corporation where there's shares of stock and you can issue granular amounts of ownership and options and all the rest of that stuff. Louis, you were about to jump in with something profound.
Well, I just wanted to underline something Natasha said, that it really is the right corporate structure really depends on the kind of business you're going to have. The kind of businesses I work with generally are high growth technology, life sciences, clean energy businesses. These are businesses that are going to raise significant amounts of capital, either because it's going to take a lot of R&D to bring it to market, or it's going to be a lot of sales and marketing to bring it to market. And if ever you want to raise outside capital, you need a C-Corp. You need a C-Corp for two reasons. One is a C-Corp is going to give you, the founder and the initial investors, qualified small business stock, QSBS, which under section 1202 of the Internal Revenue Code means that if you hold it for 5 years and satisfy the other criteria, we won't go into that, it's too much detail, but easy to do, you're tax-free if you sell it in 5 years, tax-free to the feds. Now state, that depends state by state. In California, they'll still tax you at ordinary income rates of 13%. But you're still scot-free of 37% of federal taxes. This is pretty incredible, folks. So I really encourage you, if you're going to raise capital, don't do the LLC ever. Because you cannot get QSBS through an LLC. You can't get it through an S-Corp. You can't get it by buying it from somebody else. You can only get it at formation and in the early stages when it's issued by the company. So a C-Corp is usually the right answer. Now, if you're going to form a lifestyle business, a consulting business, a law firm, an accounting firm, then you're going to be an S-Corp or an LLC, and that's great. It's just you shouldn't be listening to this program because we're here to help high growth companies get foreign finance scaled for growth, bought and sold. Right. So really it is the C-Corp. The S-Corp is a very fascinating thing because it can give you pass-through tax treatment, and it's very interesting if you have a family-owned restaurant or a family-owned real estate business where it's all inside the state. But if you're doing a tech company, you can't get QSBS. And while you might save some employment taxes in the short term, and you might be able to run through some expenses through and offset those against some other income you have, which is why your CPAs will tell you to do an LLC. In the longer term, it's terrible.
Yeah. And just to go back on kind of what you were saying, Louis, it also ties into ownership, right? Who's going to own the entities, right? So for C-Corp, there's no restrictions on the type of ownership, whereas for an S-Corp, it has to be U.S. individuals, citizens, or residents. So that's another thing to take into consideration when you're thinking of like how do I want to form it. But I agree with Louis. Usually LLC, S-Corp, we're thinking those are like lifestyle companies, not necessarily looking for high growth.
Right. So really quickly, Audrey asked the question. I think you already. Oops, sorry. Okay. Put to the wrong one. Audrey asked the question about, and Natasha, you mentioned this before, that many people start off as an LLC and then down the road they want to convert.
Yeah.
Any quick words on that?
Absolutely. So you can convert, right? You can be an LLC in any state, convert to, typically when we do conversions, we convert to a Delaware C-Corp, obviously, right? Because you're looking to get some type of funding, and that's where most companies incorporate. And so, like I said, it's not impossible. It is going to cost additional, funds in order to convert, but it is something that I don't want to say can be unraveled, but can be fixed. We've done it in the past.
And work with the tax lawyer to get QSBS when you do that conversion, Audrey. There are some tricks and tips to.
There are very good tricks.
But the default is you wouldn't get QSBS, so we have to do a little jujitsu, but we can do that.
Yeah.
So you both touched on the tax flow-through thing, and it's really important kind of to understand that with a C-Corp, the taxes of the company, the earnings of the company are taxed on their own. The company files its own tax return. Mm-hmm. With LLCs and S-Corps, the profits or losses of the company are reported on your personal income tax returns. So super, super important to kind of understand that and understand that there are pros and cons to those things.
Yeah, because I think in the C-Corp, usually the downside that people say to the C-Corp is that there's two levels of taxation, right?
Correct.
There's one at the entity level, and then there's one at the distribution or the shareholder level when you actually get some distributions from the company.
Correct.
But you can hold when you make those distributions, right? Whereas for an S-Corp, for an LLC, every year you're going to get those distributions into your personal income. There's no way to kind of hold it or wait and hold out. So just depends.
Right. So again, just to reiterate what Natasha just very clearly said, there's what they call double taxation, which is that with a C-Corp, the profits of the company are taxed as corporate tax, and then when what's left over is paid out to the shareholders, then that gets taxed again as personal tax. And while that immediately sounds awful and onerous, there actually are some ways in which it's beneficial, not least of which is that you can choose when to distribute profits to the owners, to the shareholders. And it's not taxable to them until it's distributed, whereas with an LLC or an S-Corp, if you suddenly have a great year, that's immediately on your personal taxes. You can't do anything about it. Okay, and then Robert must be from the advanced class because he immediately wants to drive into what is the deal with Delaware. Natasha, you want to take that?
Sure, I know. Everyone is like, go to Delaware. Delaware is where it's at. It's kind of funny because nobody actually has offices in Delaware. I think it's just where everyone just incorporates. So really, Delaware is kind of the place where the law is most settled. So when it comes to corporate, disputes, corporate transactions, formations, anything to do with corporate law, Delaware is set. So you have certainty in terms of how the courts would look into some type of dispute that may happen, and that's typically why people choose Delaware and why investors prefer, entities to be formed in Delaware.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people are under the misimpression that it has something to do with taxes. People think, companies incorporated in Delaware in order to avoid the taxes. And that's actually not it at all. It has to do with the fact that if you are if you're going to end up in court, you would much rather be in Delaware. Is that right?
That is true.
Yeah. Because California, even if you're operating here, incorporated in Delaware, California is still going to want their taxes. You don't get a break on California taxes just because you're incorporated in Delaware, sadly. But there's a big advantage in terms of the legal system in Delaware, and that's the reason why it's the preference of most investors. I mean, every venture capital firm I know, they're going to want you to be a C-Corp in Delaware, and if you're not now, they're going to want you to do that before before the venture financing closes.
I want to address Robert's comment, though. What is the downside of Delaware? And I think there is no downside, but if there was one, there is an incremental, very small amount of annual franchise taxes that must be paid if you incorporate there. That will be in addition to what you'll have to pay to the California Franchise Tax Board.
Correct.
Because they'll force us to qualify to do business here, which is almost the same cost and hassle. And then you'll have to file an annual report in Delaware, which says who are the officers and who's the registered agent for service of process. That's another fee. So you're going to have an agent in the state who can accept a lawsuit on your behalf. I use V-Corp. There are many others. And so two downsides: you pay a little bit of tax, a couple $1,000, and then you're going to pay for a registered agent a few $100. So there are some costs. And Robert, I'd love to hear what you think are the additional downsides. If you drop in the chat, we can pick that up. But Brett, I think we ought to go to the next one.
Okay. So, Louis, are there other jurisdictions that a startup founder should consider? I mean, I've heard about Wyoming. I've heard about Canada. You know, a nice island in the Caribbean.
I'll let Natasha cover Canada, but I mean, in a nutshell, you have the United States. Every state has its own corporate legal system. There is no United States corporations law. There is a United States securities law, and that'll be the subject of another podcast someday, Brett. But Delaware is where over 90% of corporations would and should go. Let's talk about Wyoming, Nevada, BVI, because they're hot topics, and then I'll let Natasha talk about Canada. So Wyoming is out on the front end of this wave of decentralization and tokenization of everything, and they have a very forward-thinking legislature which is trying to attract these businesses by legalizing entities like DAOs. Wyoming is the first state to have adopted a statute on a decentralized autonomous organization, which is the legal entity that may govern a token ecosystem. And so that would allow the opening of bank accounts and operations that in other states you don't have. So Wyoming is very interesting to consider if you're going to be doing a token business. I still don't think your top company should be there. I think that's probably where you would drop a subsidiary that would issue a token, but I still wouldn't go to Wyoming, and that's when I would go to BVI, Brett. BVI is the jurisdiction which is the most crypto advanced. So if you have a decentralized Web3 application and you're thinking of issuing a token, you probably would do that in the BVI, and you might have a Cayman's entity on top of that, but that's beyond the scope of this podcast. Finally, Nevada. Nevada has tried to compete with Delaware to be the home of America's corporations with a very easy statute. It just is not as sophisticated. The case law isn't there. Judiciary is not as experienced or as business friendly, is business predictable, and so I myself avoid it. I think that for real estate projects that are limited liability companies, some people will tell you that it's a good jurisdiction for that. So I think for a specific purpose, it might be good. But folks, the Delaware C-Corp is where you should be if you're going to be doing a high growth startup. But Natasha can talk about Canada because she's actually a Canadian qualified lawyer. Natasha.
I am. So for Canada, unlike
Natasha, does that mean you could explain the offsides rule in hockey to us?
That'll be another episode. So unlike the US, in Canada, you can be federally incorporated or provincially incorporated. So it could be across all provinces or per province you can be incorporated. The benefits of being incorporated in Canada vary. It depends on the composition of the founders and the shareholders. So in Canada, they have a concept called the CCPC, Canadian Controlled Private Corporation, and that affords you a variety of tax benefits and concessions that the government affords these individuals just to help them grow their business. One that is similar to the US is the SR&ED credit. So a lot of founders that are doing innovative technology businesses in Canada get a lot of resources in terms of helping to move their business forward, and it's a tax credit. So it is pretty lucrative for a lot of those companies. I think it would really depend on what your business is, and if your market is focused on the Canadian market, I would say absolutely it's a great place to be. And similar to the US, there are always ways to tax plan and coordinate so that you can access some of the more preferential tax treatments that are available in Canada.
Great. So it sounds like the summary on jurisdiction is Delaware remains the safe choice.
Yeah.
That you can't go wrong with Delaware. Very friendly laws to have your company incorporated there. If you are a crypto startup, you might consider the crypto-friendly jurisdictions of Wyoming or the British Virgin Islands. And if you want to know more about hockey or curling, or want to take advantage of perhaps some of the small business incentives and such that Canada has, then Canada might be a worthwhile consideration.
Curling is actually very fun.
Curling?
I never thought I would say that, but it is actually very fun.
Natasha, it's right up there with ice fishing for me.
All right, so Suresh asked quickly about timeline and steps. Is this something that takes a week, a month, 6 months?
Well, Suresh, I think the answer to that is you really want to find a lawyer that is convenient to you, that you have a good connection with, that represents a lot of startups. It's important that you work with somebody who is really enmeshed in this ecosystem, because otherwise you can spend a lot of time and dollars reconfiguring the wheel. So together with Natasha, we co-lead a team in Silicon Valley that has 25 lawyers and paralegals on staff and are managing hundreds of companies at any one stage. So we do it with technology-enabled tools, with non-lawyers, and with processes to do it quickly. And so the way we do it is we're going to have an intake call. We're going to learn what we think we need to know to make sure you're the right fit for what we're going to do. We're going to give you a questionnaire with all the questions that we need you to answer in order to prepare your startup. We're going to use tried and true forms that have been tested through time, legislation, and litigation to do things right and in a way that will attract the kind of capital that you're looking to raise. And then we're going to do it in the same day. So the short answer is your startup can be formed instantly if you're ready to go, but it probably will take some time and reflection for you to talk through issues with your co-founders, financing sources, potential customers, and you should spend a little time finding the right lawyer before you even do that.
Yeah.
But
always good advice.
If I was going to be forming a new startup, I would hire Natasha. Natasha, what did I miss in that whole process?
There you go. No, I agree. I think streamline. You want to look for a law firm that can streamline the process, right? Because a lot of the information, if we get it up front, we can pull the documents together and get them over to the state within a short period of time.
Yeah, and I think that as Natasha said earlier, you can, if you decide you don't like your choice of entity, you form an LLC and you decide you want to be a C-Corp, or you decide you want to be an S-Corp or whatever. As Natasha said, those things can all be done. But, like everything else, it takes a little bit of time, a little bit of money, a little bit of distraction. And so in a perfect world, you want to form the right entity at the beginning that will last you for a long time. Yeah. And so spending the time required to kind of think through the pros and cons and make a choice that will last you for a while, I think it's probably worth doing. I always say that running a startup, running a company is difficult enough as it is, without adding in kind of unnecessary distraction, like oh my God, I'm an LLC and now I want to raise some venture capital, and now I got to convert to a C-Corp, and now my CPA says I got to do a look back on the taxes because we had a bunch of losses that got passed through to my personal taxes, and it's
Oops.
So all things being equal, you're much better off kind of making the right decision to begin with that can last you for a while.
Yeah. So if, a couple other things that we can kind of put our arms around of what you should be thinking about is the name, right? The name of your company. Make sure you're doing like a Google search to make sure it's available. Make sure you're doing the correct searches to make sure the name is available. You don't want to build up all this goodwill and, around a name that's not even available to you. So that's something that you also want to think about when you're incorporating, is what is going to be the name of my entity, and is it even available?
Yes, although the name of the legal name of the entity doesn't have to match the trade name. correct?
No, it does not. But both have to be available.
Both have to be available.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent point. And these days, usually the domain has to be available too.
Yes.
These days you want an internet domain that matches your brand name.
Exactly.
So spend a little time researching all of that, and also perhaps research trademarks on the trademark site, the USPTO site, right?
Yep.
So we're coming up on a half an hour, so I think we'll wrap this up in the next few minutes. But this has been really great, and I think that to me, kind of the decision of what kind of entity to form boils down to three things. First of all, there's the protection from liability, the fact that if you do nothing, then under the law you're considered a sole proprietor, which means that if somebody sues you, they're coming after your assets personally. And forming a legal entity, any of the ones we've discussed, gives you liability protection. So that's kind of the first thing to think about. The second thing to think about is the tax flow through. Do you want the company to file taxes on its own and to have the corporate taxes taxed on their own, separate from your personal? Or are you okay having it on your personal tax return? And there's some cases, of course, where it's beneficial to have it on your personal tax return, especially for some kinds of real estate investments where there's a lot of passive losses that you'd like to take advantage of on your personal return. And LLC and S-Corp have the tax flow through. C-Corp does not. C-Corp, the taxes are separate. The company files its own tax return. And then the third element is the capital structure, meaning the ownership. Do we need the ability to issue shares of stock? Do we need the ability to be highly granular with those, with that equity distribution and offer options? Natasha, you touched on the fact that I believe S-Corps, the shareholders have to be natural people. In other words, they can't be funds. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes. So that's a big thing, because if a venture capitalist is going to invest, they're going to be investing from a fund. And so there are certain kinds of structures where shareholders can't be funds. They have to be individual people.
So for S-Corps, you can have trusts or like exempt organizations.
I see. Okay.
Specific.
Okay. Great. So capital structure, meaning who owns what kinds of entities are the owners, et cetera. I think those are kind of the three dimensions that one thinks about with regard to choosing entities. Natasha and Louis, do I have that approximately correct?
Excellent. You're on mute, Louis. But yes, I think that is it.
I notice he's a lot quieter when he's on mute.
Yeah, people do that, Brent. Sometimes we're on Zooms and they just mute me without me knowing. Not saying you did that.
Excellent. And so sort of last point on this is that certainly in the Silicon Valley world, as soon as you start hiring employees, as soon as you start recruiting employees, the very first question they're going to ask is, tell me about my stock options.
Yeah.
So that has to be a C-Corp. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can do equity interests and grants and incentives for employees with an LLC or an S-Corp, but it's complicated and has some pretty wonky tax impacts. Some of them good, some of them not so good. But Delaware C-Corp is certainly the way to go if you want to have a standard stock option. For some companies, Brett, that even should be an LLC, they find that explaining the profits interest concept to employees and how it's better than a stock option it causes so much lost time and confusion that in and of itself is a reason to be a C-Corp. So hopefully that's useful information for those founders out there.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think the summary here is that C-Corp in Delaware is the kind of the accepted, well understood structure for tech startups in Silicon Valley. It doesn't mean it's right for everybody. There are some reasons why you might want to be an LLC, or you might want to be an S-Corp, or perhaps you even want to be a B-Corp, which is recognized in a certain number of states. But Delaware C-Corp is certainly the safe choice, especially if you plan to raise any venture capital. Natasha, any last words on this? Any words of wisdom for our startup founders out there?
When you are forming, make sure you're paying attention. You don't want something to come up at diligence when you are trying to raise money or when you're trying to exit. So make sure that your formation documents are in place. And again, that goes back to who is your attorney? Are they well versed in kind of just spinning up startups? But make sure everything is set and organized from the beginning, so there are no issues on the exit or fundraising.
Excellent. Louis, any last words?
Something funny happened to me yesterday. An investor called me up, said he's going to be dropping in a safe into a company, and he said, "What diligence should I do?" And I explained to him all the diligence that I think he should do, and he said, "Well, that's really the same as for any seed investment." I said, "Yeah, because it's the same check size, isn't it?"
Exactly.
He said, "Yeah, it is." I said, "Oh, great. Well, you really should know that the company is properly formed and the founder has been issued stock subject to some kind of vesting, and you know that they're not skipping town." So I think there's a phenomenon out there, Brett, where there's so much seed capital still moving through the system, despite whatever pullback we're seeing in the general public markets, that not a lot of diligence is being done. But that just means it won't get caught until later, and it'll even be a bigger problem by the time it gets fixed.
Yeah, it always gets caught eventually.
Exactly.
And the longer it's been, the more difficult it can be to unravel it. And so,
exactly,
as I said earlier, running a company is hard enough as it is without dealing with skeletons that fall out of the closet during due diligence. And so, make sure that you've got everything nice and tidy and sewn up so that you can focus on building a great business. All right, Natasha and Louis, thank you so much. This has been terrific. To our audience, thank you for joining us this morning, and join us next Wednesday as we talk about venture capital term sheets. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Bye.